Conversations with Cait, a podcast centered on the arts, culture, and race and gender politics. It's March, and do you know what that means? It's Women's History Month. I'm Cait Malilay, and for today's topic, we will be discussing women and witches. For today's guest speaker, I have Rachel Christ, the Director of Education at the Salem Witch Museum. She is joining us via Zoom all the way from Salem, Massachusetts. Good morning, Rachel. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here.
Let's start from the beginning. How did this whole mass hysteria start?
So essentially, in January of 1692, the daughter and niece of Salem Village's newest minister, Samuel Parris, they became ill with a strange and mysterious malady. So they're falling to the ground, they're clutching their heads, they're crying, they're yelling. It's very alarming to the adults in their lives. Nobody's quite sure what's wrong with them. These girls are quite young. They're 9 years old and 11 years old. A month goes by. They're not getting any better. And eventually they bring in a doctor who says, I don't have a medical explanation for what's going on here. It looks to me like this is the effect of bewitchment. So meaning they're being hurt by witchcraft. And that kind of triggers the whole episode.
This next question is more two-part. Tituba was the slave of Reverend Samuel Parris. She was believed to be from either the Caribbean or South Florida. Can you discuss more about the role of race in the Salem Witch Trials? And did the fear of witchcraft always exist among Europeans, or did the suspicion only begin when other countries were colonized?
So the role of race in the Salem Witch Trials is very interesting. We actually last February did an entire event on that. It was a virtual event and it's all available on our YouTube page. So if anybody's interested in a more deep dive into the subject, I strongly recommend checking out that lecture. But in short, essentially, witchcraft is a belief that has existed among Europeans for years and years, for centuries before the Salem Witch Trials. So at this time, a witch is defined as a person who is thought to have sold their soul to the devil. So they've done basically the worst thing imaginable in Christian society, and they've turned to, for lack of a better term, the dark side. So this is an idea that really gets solidified in the 1400s, is when you start seeing people talking about this new group of heretics who are labeled as witches. And witch hunts happen for hundreds of years. So all through the 14, 15, 1600s. And the Salem Witch Trials are actually pretty late in the witch trials period. Now, normally witchcraft accusations, they're more gendered than racially motivated. So, and that's to say that the people who are most commonly accused of witchcraft are people who don't fit into society. So oftentimes that means it's women who are pushing against social norms in some way. They are beggars, women who have done something socially unusual, like had a child before marriage or fought openly with their husbands or their neighbors, women who are independently employed working as midwives or healers. These are the people who are targeted most commonly during witch trials. And that's also partially based in the early literature of the witch trials. The first major book, the first super popular book about witchcraft is the Malleus Maleficarum. And that book essentially says women are less intelligent, they are easier to be tricked and easier to be seduced by the devil. So 9 times out of 10, if you're looking for a witch, you're looking for a woman. And that's a super influential book. So it's not that if we look at kind of the grand scheme of the European witch trials, again, it's more gender driving those accusations, and we can say the kind of effects of patriarchal society of the time. However, if we zoom in on the Salem witch trials, race is a really interesting factor to consider here. So first things first, one of the first people to be accused is an enslaved woman. Now, we don't know where Tituba is from. The kind of most common theory, or the theory that has the most credence behind it, is that she's probably from the Caribbean or South Florida. She is thought to have maybe been from the Arawak tribe and was then purchased by Samuel Parris in Barbados when he lived there. And she is a really easy person to scapegoat because she doesn't fit into society. So when the first girls, come down with their affliction and they say, there's witches hurting you, who are the witches? The first three people they name are, again, those kind of people who don't fit into society. So they name the slave living in their house, Tituba, and then they name two women who are kind of social outsiders for various reasons, a beggar and a woman who has married one of her servants. So if we kind of zoom out, though, another important factor of race here is this ongoing tension between the English colonists and the indigenous inhabitants of New England. Because for years leading up to 1692, there have been extremely bloody, brutal conflicts, King Philip's War and King William's War, which are causing enormous amount of casualties on both sides. So the colonists, the English colonists, very much view the natives as devil worshippers or even demons. And they're very much afraid that natives are going to come out of the woods at night and kidnap them and take them away and things like that, which is part of this ongoing conflict. There are all these stories circulating in Salem Village in Maine, the bloody, violent things that they've witnessed while living there. So this kind of ongoing fear and tension about the indigenous inhabitants and the belief that they are so connected to the devil, that's really driving fear at this point. That wouldn't necessarily have ended up in a witchcraft trial had the affliction not started in Samuel Parris's house and, the kind of sequence goes as it does. So that's a very long explanation, but and there's so much more to talk about there. So again, if anybody's interested in that subject, definitely watch that lecture we did last year. We really spent a lot of time and effort researching this.
And some men were actually accused of witchcraft. What made males targeted for witchcraft? Were they outsiders as well?
Yeah, so just because women are most commonly targeted, it doesn't mean they're exclusively targeted. So again, a witch at this time is just anybody who was believed to have sold their soul to the devil. So that could be anyone. It's not technically a gendered crime if we look at the actual definition. So that means that men were accused alongside women, children were accused as well. In Salem, when we really start to look at how the pattern of accusations spreads, there's a lot going on behind these different accusations. It could be that you challenged one of the afflicted girls and said, I don't believe you're really being tormented by the devil, or I don't believe that you're really sick. So people who openly vocalize skepticism, that's what happens in the case of John Willard and John Proctor, who are both men who are executed. You see some men like Samuel Wardwell, who's another man who was executed during the witch trials in Salem. He had been a fortune teller. So he lives in Andover, a couple towns away. And for years, he had been palm reading and telling people their futures and things like that, which you're not technically supposed to do in colonial New England, but people did it anyway. Usually that would just result in like a slap on the wrist from your minister. But in the environment of growing witchcraft fears, that makes you ripe for an accusation in 1692. And then you see men like George Burroughs, who was once the minister in Salem Village and had left when the factional divide became too much for him. He kind of just up and left. There's a lot of, it seems like, tension between some of the leading families and George Burroughs in Salem. We're never going to know exactly what beef there really was. There's clearly some sort of problem between him and, again, those leading families, namely the Putnams. What exactly happened doesn't exist in court records, but it seems like that tension from years ago is probably what drives his accusation. So you could be accused of witchcraft for a variety of factors. And again, anybody is susceptible to a witchcraft accusation, particularly once the fear really escalates. Anybody can be named, including the governor's own wife. She's named at the very end. It's really many different things at the end of the day.
And you mentioned that two women who were accused of witchcraft that stood out to you the most were Susanna Martin and Martha Carrier. Can you tell us more about them?
Yeah, they're two women that I just find them very fascinating. The kind of annoying part, or annoying, I guess isn't the best term, but the hard part about researching women in the colonial period is it's so hard to gather details of their lives or of their character. Women really exist in the records through the details of their husbands' lives. And you only really get to kind of see some of the elements of who they are as people if they do something wrong. So in the case of the Salem Witch Trials, there's quite a few women who are accused and executed who we wouldn't know really anything about had they not been involved in these trials. So Susanna Martin and Martha Carrier are two women who you just really, at least I really am captivated by their stories because they argue back with the magistrates. So when you read the court transcripts from their examinations, both of them are just, they will take none of this. They stand there and they say, I am not a witch. You guys are crazy. These witnesses are lying. And, this whole thing's a sham. Like, they really stand up for themselves. And you see that in the court records. And if you look at the details of their lives leading up to 1692, Susanna Martin had been accused of witchcraft before. Again, likely because she's a really strong, independent woman, or we could say at least a very unusual woman for the colonial period. And her husband defends her in court when she is accused. Martha Carrier, too, is this woman who seems to just be really strong. She really fights for herself and for her independence and for her life. And unfortunately, both of them are executed during the conflict. But it's really interesting to kind of look at their court transcripts because you see this glimmer of who these women were, which is just fascinating to look back at.
According to the Salem Witch Museum website, in the modern world, the word witchcraft has taken on a variety of new meanings. Today, thousands participate in a religion commonly referred to as modern-day witchcraft. This religion includes reverence for nature, belief in the rights of others, and pride in one's own spirituality. Can you discuss more about these practices?
Absolutely. So the fascinating part about studying witchcraft is that it starts with this unbelievably tragic history that, again, really targets women. You see women who are unusual and independent and strong. They're often the ones being targeted during witchcraft trials. But then as time goes on, the idea of a witch really grows and evolves and shifts with our culture. And by the time you get to the 20th century, not only do we start to have good, empowered witches who can be strong feminist characters in pop culture, but witchcraft actually is embraced as a religion. So contemporary pagan practices, neo-paganism, very much embraces the idea of the witch. So in short, basically in the 20th century, you see this movement of people looking back at pagan religions. There's been an occult movement growing for years and years before this. And you see a man named Gerald Gardner come forward and say, I have uncovered this fertility cult that is practicing these older pagan practices that's been underground for years, and they call themselves witches, and they were the ones targeted during the witchcraft trials. So he fabricates a lot. His view of the history of the witch trials is wrong, but what he does is he sparks this movement where people become really interested in spirituality and in these older pre-Christian religious traditions. And it grows and blossoms into this beautiful, ever-expanding religion. By the time you get to the 70s, this religion is just growing, growing, growing. in America in particular, you see it link up with the feminist movement, and you see this wave of people called spiritual feminists. So you see this kind of increasing shift of people calling themselves witches and practicing magic and spellcraft and things like that. But in a way that's really based on meditation. It's based on getting in tune with nature. It's not, when people hear the word magic, they tend to think of people trying to, make themselves fly and things like that. And that's not what magic means in this case. It's people who are trying to get in tune with the collective unconscious and are trying to, grow and evolve in a deeper spiritual way that is very different than the Abrahamic religions. So today, this just keeps growing. People call themselves witches with many different meanings connected to it, and it's really become a term of empowerment, particularly connected to the feminist movement.
It's so funny because in my documentary film analysis class, I'm actually doing like another episode on the feminist movement, and then it actually tied in. Was the movement that you were referring to one of the groups? Was it the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell group?
Yeah, it's one of those groups. Yeah, they are kind of the I wouldn't say the showiest, but their whole thing is political theater in a way, activism in theater. So they were known for those wild, very dramatic demonstrations. They are such an interesting group, and they're part of that movement for sure.
In feminist movements, they've reclaimed like the idea of like witchcraft. Do you see a cultural appropriation issue in modern day witchcraft commodified with the rise in popularity of crystal healing and natural herbs when we don't acknowledge like the historical roots?
In a way, I mean, it definitely gets out of control. And that's really just capitalism, if we're going to be honest, that capitalism appropriates everything. If it can find something to market, it will. So, you see, I know there was a huge outcry years ago when Sephora made some sort of makeup palette that they bundled with sage or something like that. And there was a huge backlash for that. So, and you see all the time, crystals and healing and, with no, not necessarily any strong foundation behind it, but that, that's going to happen in a capitalist society with really any growing movement, and that's okay. I think it gives people a chance to find this and learn more. So, if a 13-year-old girl is walking through Target and sees a crystal pack, that might spark in them an interest in this that they can grow in a more organic way. So I don't necessarily think it's ultimately, a be-all end-all evil. It's just something that we all need to keep in mind and, remember that if you're interested in this kind of spirituality, it's always better to do your homework and learn more about the products you're buying. But that's also the case, again, for just capitalist society in general, especially where we are now.
Would you say like movies like Practical Magic with Sandra Bullock, personally one of my favorites, would you say like Hollywood is accurate in their depictions, or like even like in literature, Alice Hoffman's books?
Well, it depends on what we mean by accurate, right? Because at the end of the day, nobody was ever really a witch, until we have a scientific breakthrough that tells us the devil is real and, you can kill someone with the glance of your eye and things like that. We can safely assume that all of the people who were accused of witchcraft were innocent. And then if we're talking about modern day witchcraft, again, modern day witchcraft isn't about trying to manipulate the laws of physics, be able to fly or jump off your roof like they do in Practical Magic. It's a lot more, I don't want to say intellectual than that, but, it's a lot more about, we would call it maybe new age spirituality, meditation, focused mental exercises, tapping into the collective unconscious. So Hollywood's depiction of witches is, it's its own category. It's really evolved in and of itself with time. The idea of a good witch blossoms first with The Wizard of Oz when we have Glinda the Good. That's really the first time you see someone described as a good witch. And that's a book that comes out in 1900. And then throughout the 20th century, you slowly see this increase in versions of the witch that are first beautiful in a femme fatale kind of way. And then with time, more and more uniquely good, independent, autonomous, even superhero-esque characters. In the 90s, we get, the not the 90s, the 70s, we get the Scarlet Witch, literally a Marvel character who is a witch. So the idea of a witch in Hollywood kind of grows on its own, and it becomes 9 times out of 10, at least from the 90s on, we see these kind of really nice, empowering witch characters alongside the traditional, scary hag witch that's born during the European witch trials. So, these kind of stories about women who live on the outskirts of society and have cauldrons and eat children. These are all real things that were said during the European witch trials, that kind of, once the witch trials are over, make their way into folklore and fairy tales and continue with us in pop culture today. So we have, of course, like Hocus Pocus, those witches as well.
Now, I have to ask this. When people think of Salem, Massachusetts, of course, what first comes to mind is witches. In Salem, because of its history, would you describe the community as superstitious?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I would say no, not necessarily superstitious. The Salem Witch Trials obviously left their mark in an, ever impactful way in Salem. For years, though, Salem didn't talk about its witch-related history. This is a tragic thing that happened, and it really, Danvers, which is one town over, that's where the initial accusations began, the initial affliction began. A lot of the accusers and many of the accused lived. And Salem, what is today Salem, was where the trials themselves were held. But in many ways, Salem was not exactly the epicenter of the trials. It's where the trials move to once the events are rolling. And for years, both Salem and Danvers just didn't talk about it. People wanted to move on. They wanted to move on with their lives. And witch trials happened in the colonial period. People believed in witchcraft, and this did happen sometimes. Not on the scale of Salem. We're unusual because things got so unbelievably out of control. But, believing in witchcraft and believing in the devil was just part of your life at this time. So Salem moved on. It was a seaport, so there was an incredible mercantile history for a long time. And then when that slowly started to taper off, we had an industrial boom. The Industrial Revolution was huge here. We were a factory city. And then in 1914, there's a huge fire that burns down a huge amount of the factories here, and it leaves an economic void. And it was really that economic void that years later results in the tourism industry here, with that focus on witch history, because that's what the tourists were interested in. People coming here wanted to learn about witchcraft history. So we definitely have our ghost stories and legends and things like that. A lot of those are made up, to be honest, to appease tourists. If you ever hear about the curse of Giles Corey, who's the man who was tortured to death during the trials, that's a story we know exactly who made it up and when. That's one of those things that if you actually live here, you don't believe in. So, as a community, I wouldn't say we're superstitious, but I would say particularly now, Salem is a place where so many modern practitioners of witchcraft live. We're a very open, welcoming community, and there's, spirituality everywhere you go here.
Do a lot of the descendants, are there still descendants from the Salem witch trials living in Salem?
Yeah, in Salem, all over the country, and even you could say at least all over Europe, if not the world, there are thousands and thousands of people who can trace their ancestry to the Salem witch trials. Many people can trace their ancestry to specific families as well. So we have to remember during this time, people had like 8 to 10 kids, kind of on average. So people like Rebecca Nurse, who was executed, John Proctor, we meet those descendants very frequently. And it's always really interesting to hear, what they know from family stories, if they've just discovered their ancestry. the rise of Ancestry.com has very much led many, many more people to realize that they are descended from people from the witchcraft trials. If you know that your family lived here at some point in the 17th century, you're probably related to someone from the Salem Witch Trials. And yeah, living in this area, you see people whose families never left, especially in Danvers, again, which was Salem Village in 1692.
And for any curious readers who wanted to learn more about the Salem Witch Trials or witches in general, or perhaps Susanna Martin or Martha Carrier, what book recommendations would you give?
So Marilyn Roach is a phenomenal writer. She is a historian of the Salem Witch Trials, and she wrote a really great book called Six Women of Salem. And that's a book. Susanna Martin and Martha Carrier are not the one of of the six women, but it focuses on the stories of an accuser, an accused who's executed, an accuser who lives. Tituba is one of the six. So that's a really interesting book if you just want to learn more about the individual women. In terms of fiction books, I can't recommend enough the series Heretic's Daughter and Traitor's Wife. They're written by Kathleen Kent, who is a descendant of Martha Carrier. And this is historical fiction, but it's really well-written historical fiction. It's very accurate. I personally have a very hard time reading historical fiction about the Salem Witch Trials because if it's inaccurate, it drives me crazy. But Kathleen Kent did a really nice job. And so Heretic's Daughter is about Martha Carrier during the Salem Witch Trials, and Traitor's Wife is a prequel about her life before the witch trials. Both are excellent books. And then we also offer through our museum, through our education department, descendant packets. So these are $10 resource packets for people who can trace their ancestry to the Salem Witch Trials, or for people who are just interested in learning more about the people involved in these events as individuals. So we put an enormous amount of time and effort into writing and researching these packets. They each include a biography of the person that range from 3 to 4 pages to 10 to 15 pages as we get crazier and crazier. And we're just putting in as much information about these people's lives as we can find. So initially we only had 20 packets for the individuals who were executed. We're now expanding this to include other stories. So accusers, accused who lived, things like that. So if you're interested in any one person in particular, Susanna Martin or Martha Carrier, I would suggest checking out those descendant packets because they're really helpful resources in terms of learning about each individual person.
Rachel Christ, Director of Education at the Salem Witch Museum, we thank you for your time.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to Conversations with Cait, a podcast centered on the arts, culture, and race and gender politics. Be a part of the conversation. What are your thoughts on the depiction of women and witches in pop culture? You can also follow my Instagram at CAIT_MALILAY_rights for updates on future articles and episodes. For those of you who are interested in learning more about the Salem Witch Trials or would like book recommendations, please visit salemwitchmuseum.com. For all my self-identifying women listeners out there, I celebrate you. As the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell group would say to the patriarchal society, knowledge is power through which you control our mind, our spirit, our bodies, our soul. Hex!